got some slides here. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Paul and Nelson, for inviting me here. It's really fun to be back in Madison. I'm a lover of this place. And, of course, China's talk before that again. Thanks a lot for making it so hard for us followers. I'm going to take a look at the planet we've created, the idea that we've just come here to change everything for the worst, I think doesn't really get at what we've done on this planet. And I'm going to talk about really some of the planetary opportunities we have to do things better. So we've got this concept of the Anthropocene, or the Anthropocene. Thank you very much for introducing that, Kevin and Paul. So we have this idea of humans transforming the planet permanently, creating a new geological time period. So I'm going to talk about that. When did the Anthropocene begin? Second, what is the nature of this biosphere that we've created, the anthropogenic biosphere? And I'll talk about the structure of the biosphere we created and how that both produces some challenges and some opportunities for conserving nature and for building a better place for humanity in the future. And then I'll talk about some of the planetary opportunities that I see coming in the near term that are actually underway right now. And one of the most interesting opportunities, I think a lot of you are familiar with this idea that urbanization is green. Urbanization is actually one of our greatest opportunities to do better with the whole planet, not just with the cities, but to do better with the whole planet. This is the Holocene biosphere. We've been talking here about this safe operating space of the Holocene, this natural place in which life on Earth is shaped by the global patterns of climate. And we're all familiar with these global patterns. Everyone learns this early in school. The deserts, the tropical rainforests, the grasslands. These are the classic global ecological patterns. Okay, but we don't live in the Holocene anymore. We have transformed the planet. And here we get again this iconic image of the Earth now glowing at space for the first time in history. Right now I have a planet that if you look at it from space, from say Saturn, you could, if you had the right instruments, detect that there's a new force has emerged on this planet. It is not a biological force. None of us can light up at night. It requires this emergent property of all of us interacting together over huge areas of space, time, bringing resources around the world, using technologies that developed by ancestors. There's no possible way for any of us to light up the Earth. It requires all of us to do this, and we are all doing it. The same problem, of course, is that none of us can just turn it all off. Not one person can do this. If we wish to change the way the Earth glows at night, it's going to take all of us. I think that is, in an essence, the Anthropocene. We have a new global force that's emerged. It has emerged on top of us as biological entities, as organisms. It's another level, a new force on the planet, one which is created by us, but one that we do not actually control. It's really a little bit beyond us at this point. And one of the most fascinating challenges for the long term, looking back, how we came to actually manage this new force is going to be the story of the future. One classic view of the Anthropocene, and the one that is actually now most widely advocated by the geological group, the Anthropocene Working Group of the International Commission of Stratigraphy, that is studying and proposing that the Anthropocene be added as a formal geological time period, is this idea of the Great Acceleration. In the last 50 years, things have changed very rapidly. If you look at most of global climate change, it's happening very recently, or at least the anthropogenic global warming, and a lot of the emissions. Everything spiked in the 50s. And going along with that, we have an event that did produce a novel geological effect. The atomic bomb is responsible for spewing a new form of element. Some new elements and some very rare elements have been distributed around the Earth, the radionuclides. And these are a nice, permanent global signal of what humans have added to the Earth, something novel and unusual, unambiguous. It's got to be humans. It's not something else that caused this. This is the vision of the Anthropocene that is being produced right now by geologists. This defines what we've done. And I have to admit, I am profoundly dissatisfied with this. I really can't go along with this. A little easier, I think, to understand is, I think, another common proposal, but one is that actually, like I said, it's not actually the primary proposal right now by geologists at least, is the Industrial Revolution, right? The harnessing of a new energy source that really did change everything socially and ecologically. Fossil fuel combustion enabled us to do new things, and it started changing the planet rapidly. It changed the climate system, okay? And a fairly recent development in Earth history, right? A couple hundred years, and it does have profound global effects that are measurable, not unambiguously human. Climate change has always happened on this planet. This is very rapid climate change, maybe unprecedentedly rapid, but it's climate change. It's not absolutely novel on the planet. Of course, burning fossil fuel to do it is. This is the picture you get of humanity changing the planet when we consider the Industrial Revolution and burning fossil fuel essentially as the process by which we've changed the planet, this recent burning of fossil fuel. But if you really want to look deeply at how we've changed the planet, the most profound and permanent change we've made in the planet so far, now with burning fossil fuel, we are rapidly working on creating new forms of global change that will be unambiguous, potentially very big changes, but so far, we haven't made that big change yet. We are in the process of doing it. Agriculture has already transformed most of the planet. About 40% of all of Earth's land is now used for crops, pastures, and our settlements. We have transformed this Holocene biosphere, which could have supported maybe a few million hunter-gatherers. That's about it. That's about the extent of what the Holocene could do for us, into this new human, anthropogenic biosphere that now sustains 7 billion people and is going to sustain 9 billion. That is what we have created. We've changed the whole world to make it more productive for us. That's, of course, challenged all those species that are not us. We have left very little, actually, out there in a state without us, without our land use, without our populations. Only about 29 million square kilometers, or about a quarter of the Earth's ice-free land is now in a state you could still call wild. And notice only about 20% of Earth's tree cover is in that category. It's a very small fraction. So when you think of wild places to save out there, wild forests, wild tropical forests do exist. They do exist. However, they are not very common. Maybe that's the best reason of all to save them. But when you're thinking about the biosphere, is this the most common state of the kind of the biosphere out there, this wild biosphere? No. When you're looking at the wild biosphere, it's mostly places that people are really not that interested in living and using the land. It's dry places, cold places, and such. That's most of the wild biosphere that we have left today. Much more common is this semi-natural state, where we've either used the land at one point or we're using it at very low levels at the current time. So we have an influence of lower levels of population, lower levels of land use. That's called the semi-natural anthrome or anthropogenic biome, this human-created nature. And you can see a whole lot more tree cover is in this category. A large amount of Earth's forests are in this state of essentially living in our midst. Sorry. Should have only taken the one with one forward. We have these all over the world, of course, it's being so common. And you see the semi-natural forests, they have a tropical area. These have been used at one time and regrown. These, of course, look pretty common. You'd see these all over the place around here. I would bet most of the forests in your state are recovering secondary forests that have regrown after some previous use. Very common state. Rangelands abundant all over the world, one of the largest categories of human use, yet it's one of these things that is not very densely populated. It's not unfair to say a large amount of it does look like this. It's in some kind of low level of use. But we also have some very ancient areas, areas where people have sustained rangelands for thousands of years. This is the center of origin for alfalfa. Croplands. You live amongst them very nearby here. And I think, as you know, and as we'll look at, croplands are not just crops. People live in these places. There are trees in these places. In fact, a full 1/4 of Earth's tree cover is embedded within croplands. It is not out there in some wild place. It is living right close to home. So when we think about our crops coming from places like this, a lot of them do. A lot of them come from places where there's essentially nothing else going on but crops. But there are, and very commonly, in fact, most common state of croplands is this rain-fed mosaic. It's a mosaic landscape mixed together of trees, settlements, croplands, all these different things very closely mixed together. If you're from Asia, You probably come from a village if you don't live there right now. Huge numbers of people live in densely populated agricultural landscapes. Less and less, it turns out, but in the past, at least, this was a huge category of these densely populated agricultural landscapes. And they vary from something like this, densely populated rice landscape, thousands of years of sustained human populations in these areas. This is an example of a very diverse type of landscape that you see in these places, also ancient. Urban and dense settlements, this is an area, of course, that we're all familiar with because we actually, most of us, I think, live in these areas. Not very extensive globally. If you look globally at the total amount of land that you could call a dense settlement or an urban area, it's only about between 1% and 2% of Earth's land. So if you're concerned about urban areas expanding over all the rest of Earth's land, your concern is misplaced. It's not a large area. Not to say that these areas don't have huge impacts on the rest of the world, and it depends on how those people live. When we think about people living in urban areas as living in places like this is actually extraordinarily rare. The most common form of urban settlement is a third world city that has essentially a sprawling form that you've never heard of. That is the most common form. When you look at that 1% to 2% of Earth's land in settlements, it's mostly like this. And of course, no talk would be complete without beautiful Baltimore row houses. So when we look at the world from the point of view not of the Holocene without people, but look at it with people, what does nature look like? Well, people live in very concentrated ways for the most part. About 80% of people live in the urban and village anthropogenic biomes. In terms of land area, only about a quarter of Earth's land could still be considered in this wild state, and a full 3/4 have been transformed in these anthropogenic biomes. Wild forest area today is less than the area of urban areas and villages. So when you're thinking about the ecology of the planet, you have to think about urban areas and villages as much as wild forests. In terms of net primary production is the amount of energy that can be used by other organisms after plants harvest the energy from the sun. This is the energy that fuels all life on Earth. It fuels us, it fuels all of life on Earth. So of course it's probably the most critical indicator of what's going on the Earth in terms of life. And about 90% of Earth's net primary production is now occurring within anthropogenic biomes, and only about 10% in these wildlands. Why? Why is it so much more lopsided than land area? Because the lands in which you still have these wild areas tend to be very low productivity areas. So that's a pretty, I think, central concept to understanding nature, is that most of nature, most of life on Earth is embedded within these human landscapes. A full quarter, again, of Earth's tree cover is embedded within croplands. Another simple way to look at this, just to boil it all down, if we look at all the ecology on land, terrestrial ecosystems, we have about 40% of Earth's land is in the form of used areas. So in a sense, if somebody stopped using those areas, someone else would not get something. We have about a quarter that's wild. What's the other stuff in between? What is the mix? And that is a very interesting part of the Earth. That's the novel ecosystem. Those are the ecosystems that are embedded within the used landscapes that we create, but that we're not necessarily using right now. They may be in some state of recovery, they may be some kind of planting, but they're not actively used to produce for us. They are an opportunity. So this structure occurs. Why do we have novel ecosystems? It's because we rarely use all the land for one thing. We rarely use all the land for agriculture and settlements. There's usually this mixture of used landscapes and mixed with that, these novel ecosystems. They can come in many different forms. And a great example, of course, let me just again. The summary here is that 40% approximately of Earth's land is in this form of novel ecosystems and the opportunities that that brings up. About 40% of these is distributed very widely. So it's not just you have this little tiny amount sitting somewhere far away from us. The novel ecosystems are embedded right in the landscapes where you live. For example, perhaps in your neighborhood, you might have some area around the river where there's some recovering forest. That would be a novel ecosystem. They're present pretty much everywhere in the world where you don't have complete use of land or completely wild land. What are these novel ecosystems like? The idea that a forest is nothing but a wild place, that ecologists could just view it as a place that has an identity that is only based on its natural ecology, doesn't deal with the fact that these are embedded within the human landscape. They have a human form, they have uses, or they have a history, a legacy, an interaction with people that creates new forms of ecology. So just like a forest could be a plantation of fast-growing trees, it could also be an old farmer's woodlot that's just recovering somewhere. And that forest is different. It's made different by people being there and interacting with it and its history. And just an example from China, where I often work, of these kinds of very novel forests. These kinds of forests involve a combination. Since it's a collaboration of different people doing different things. Some people are planting trees. Some are just letting it recover. Some are harvesting. All these things going on within this ecosystem creates a very different, a novel ecology. We need to think about this ecology not just as something lost to us. Many times people think, and there's even been this term, trash ecosystem, applied to these places that have been transformed by being embedded within our landscapes, yet they still have biodiversity. They still have, in many cases, most of the biodiversity that they once had is still there. They have ecosystem functions. They store carbon. They process nutrients. They are every bit as functional in most cases as any kind of wild and natural place. And they are much more common than those wild and natural places today. So we need to have an ecology of the novel ecosystem. A great example of this is the message that we often get about what is happening to species on Earth is a very simple message: mass extinction. It is a fact that humans have driven a lot of species extinct, and we are continuing to. And if you are in certain taxa, like a large mammal, certain types of ground-dwelling birds, you are in deep, deep trouble. And the only help is going to come from severe intervention. That is true. But remarkably, if you look at a lot of taxa, like plants, for example, 300,000 species of plants in the world, how many have gone extinct that we know of? Maybe only 300 so far. It's not actually a huge number. The biggest effect that humans have on the ecosystems and their biodiversity is to increase them, increase species richness, increase the number of species in a place. And that's not necessarily a good thing, but it is the main effect that we have, and it's the one we have to deal with the most. We bring species everywhere we go, both because we want that corn out there, but the weeds come with the corn, and there's usually a lot more weeds than corn. And the reality is, if you're a manager of an ecosystem anywhere, and you want to conserve any native species, you're going to have to deal with those other ones. And that's the real challenge. It's not the total loss here. It's that complexity that we get because of the way we transform things. It's not just about the destruction. It's about the change and the complexity of the change. The future of biodiversity is entirely up to us. We have transformed most of the biosphere, and it is up to us. And we started changing it early. The idea that we suddenly, with industrialization or the recent acceleration, started changing biodiversity is an absolute falsehood. We started changing things relatively early. As the last ice age, before the last ice age occurred, we had already driven a lot of the large fauna extinct in North America, for example, and there were huge ecological effects. Trees started growing where there never would be trees before when you knock out that big herbivore. You knock out a big carnivore and trees start growing somewhere else. Huge ecological effects were caused by hunter-gatherers who were using fire and tools. These were unprecedented technologies on this continent, and they had huge changes long before people showed up later. But most fundamentally, and this is, I think, the most important thing to grasp about humans, is that we are not adapting to our environment as much as we are adapting the environment to us. And we have always done this. Homo sapiens emerged as a species 200,000 years ago among other hominid species. Homo neanderthalis, for example, now extinct, used tools, fire, had culture. We were just one among many species of hominids that did this. We changed the landscape. But we do it even faster, even more powerfully because of our ability to both transform the environment, but to pass on the abilities, the knowledge to others, to future generations, to other places in the world. Everywhere we go, we bring more and more powerful cultural knowledge and tools that enable us to change the world to fit us. And we do that everywhere we go. And we started doing it long before agriculture. And this is an example of shifting cultivation. So this is an agricultural management scenario. This use of fire to clear land. It was done by Native Americans all around this area. I'm sure that if the first settlers came here, they didn't see unbroken forest. They saw an area that was open woodlands that was created by hunter-gatherers long before European settlers came with a plow. This was also something that was done by the first farmers, and it was just part of a sequence of human niche construction. This is a new ecological term that's growing in power that explains why it's possible for some species to, in a sense, compete others by essentially excluding other species from landscapes and essentially making a landscape more productive for themselves and essentially not for the others. We did this in lots of ways. We didn't always do it because we wanted to, but it happened because we had to. For example, once you drive that primary prey, that big species, extinct, what are you going to eat? You have to eat other stuff. And essentially, a very dominant species coming and eating stuff means if you want to grow your population anymore, you're going to have to eat more different kinds of things. And humans broadened their diets dramatically over thousands and thousands of years, learning to make use of many, many different species in the landscape, and that enabled populations to grow. We learned to burn lands to open them up, and that brings the prey, and it also helps things grow that we eat. We learned to process seeds that were essentially inedible or not useful to harvest, and that was a huge breakpoint because it enabled us to use the grasses. And I think you all know, right? We're all eating grasses 3 meals a day, more or less, okay? And that led to the propagation of our most favored species, such as the ones that we later domesticated, and then, of course, domestication, cultivation. This is a lot harder than burning a forest. Nobody does this if they don't have to. The plow, irrigation, manuring. These are all technologies that we learn to use to make environments more productive for us. We depend on these, and we use them because we have to. Nobody really likes to do this, okay? But billions of people have done this for long periods of time. They've done it because it's the only way to support so many people on so little land, as they say in Chinese, 人多地少. It's a long tradition of doing this. As our populations grew, we were forced to adopt technologies, often more labor-intensive, harder, that enabled us all to survive in limited environments. Essentially, we grew to 7 billion people by getting more out of the same land. Most of the increase in productivity that has sustained us to this point has come from intensification of our land use, putting more in to get more out of the same land. Because of this, interestingly, in the early days, back when there was no incentive to use land efficiently, there was plenty of land. Burning the land and using lots of land to produce food for one person was the norm. That's the smart thing to do. Just don't use more labor than you need to. And of course, for that reason, a very small number of people, tens of millions of people, were able to transform huge areas of the biosphere, to use huge amounts of land long ago. If you look at the effects of that, the result is that we now have a planet that has been transformed by human use of land for thousands of years, because early on, people used so much land per person. This even caused early forms of global climate change. Now, this was climate change on thousands of years. Slow climate change, not fast climate change like today. Very slow, non-threatening climate change. But the fact is, those early pre-industrial farmers already changed the earth just by using land for agriculture. Again, agriculture, the huge effect on the earth. And this person, what is he doing? In that little basket is the product of modern industry, synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. This is a lot easier to use that little bit of synthetic nitrogen than to use manure. And if you look at the early days of fertilizer, and this is an advertisement, I think all of you can look at this and say, this has got to be an advertisement. You may not read Chinese, you know this is an advertisement. It's called the Rich Farmer, Poor Farmer poster, and it depicts essentially a farmer on the one side using fertilizer and one on the other who is not. And again, the first question with any advertisement is this false advertising? Is this correct? Or is this just a bill of goods like we often get from advertising? And the true fact is that you could quadruple the productivity of your traditional agriculture. These are the most productive traditional farmers in the world, the traditional farmers of that region of China where this fertilizer advertisement was used. You could quadruple your yields just by using chemical fertilizer. Those soils were depleted of nitrogen over thousands of years. Even with the best management, and they were the best managers of traditional agriculture, they could not sustain high yields. Nobody's going back to being the poor farmer. People are going forward, and they are voting with their feet on where they want to go next. And this is happening all over the world. It already happened here for the most part in the United States, but it continues to happen as you see the transition to modern industrial agriculture, where agriculture scales up, where it is no longer the produce of a small part of land that determines your future. You can get a job and make money, and you can send your kid to college. These opportunities don't exist for peasants in the countryside. They're going to the city. So when you see this, and I think it's a good example of perhaps imperfect rapid urban development. This is not the ideal plan. It is still the best thing for these people. That's why they're going there. And it's the best thing, strangely enough, for the recovery of nature. It is a planetary opportunity. Strangely enough, with the larger scales of agriculture and people moving to the cities, we now have the potential to use less land for agriculture. It is actually possible to use less land. As a result, what you see is something similar to what you see around here, the recovery of woodlands on abandoned farmland all over the world. And this is not just something of the so-called developed world. Countries like China, you see this. India, you see this. It is going on all over the world. The recovery of forests and other ecosystems on marginal lands, lands that were never very good for farming to begin with, and essentially large-scale professional farmers have no interest in these lands. They're only interested in the best land, and the other land gets to recover. And you see it, again, all over the place. It may not be perhaps as beautiful as a primary forest, but it is a planetary opportunity to do things differently. And one of the fundamental questions about any planetary opportunity, something that could change at global scale, we could have more forests in the future than we have now. That is a real possibility. Where does that opportunity come from? Does it come from an international agreement? Or does it come from a whole change in the way the world works at the grassroots? Individual decisions of all those people going to the city are making this happen. The planetary opportunities may come from the bottom. That's maybe where the real opportunities are. And here we have a problem with the royal we, brought up very nicely by China. What about these landscapes? They need to produce for us. We need landscapes that produce for us. We can't give that up, right? With 7 billion people now, 9 billion people soon, we cannot give up agriculture. We're going to use land. But can we use it for multiple purposes? Can we use it in ways that enable wildlife to use the landscape? And it's not automatic. Just because you have habitat doesn't mean you have good habitat. And multifunctionality, this idea of using land for multiple purposes, doesn't happen without intentionality. We have to try to do this. This is, of course, the great example of the dysfunctional multifunctionality. We are not necessarily that good. Just like we can't turn off the lights on the planet, we are not necessarily so great about making all the arrangements that we need to make to agree together on doing things. But, again, when a lot of people see this, they think, we're all connected together. Look at the level of connection and commerce on this planet. Some people see this as the end of days. This is the worst thing that could happen. People are everywhere. I see this as the greatest opportunity our societies have ever had. We are now all interconnected by trade, by communication. We are the most connected human societies that have ever lived on Earth. China, not there. Oh, oops. Not that China. The key to this, again, is not about the international agreement. It's about the local people. Local people understand their ecology. Local people can manage their ecology better. Local people can interact at scales about ecology now that they could never do before. Of course, not everyone has an iPhone, but most people are getting phones and connections to the internet. That is actually happening. We can think smart about development. There are just good ideas out there that we can do that make it possible for the deer to stay out of the road. Species are recovering, and the wolf is a great example. The wolf in Europe is a classic story. You have a dangerous predator that nobody really loves, especially not face-to-face. This is a dangerous animal. It is recovering in some of the most densely populated landscapes of Europe. Nature can come back. Nature is strong. Nature is not fragile. Nature is going to be here. Nature is going to grow on the substrates we provide it. I hope this is not the best substrate we can provide for nature, but it doesn't ultimately, in the end, matter. It's going to be here. So what are we going to do with it? It's not a matter of what we're not doing with it. We're already good at talking about what not to do. There's also some things we need to think about. What are we going to do with this nature? What are we going to do when there's not more people every year? That's coming, and that's a good thing, and it's coming, and it's going to change the planet even more. Well, one thing, of course, to do is to save what we have. That's always a good thing. We still have to engineer the things we need. Agriculture is going to continue. What about the things we never even thought of doing? Ways of living that we never even thought of. That's an opportunity. And then finally, of course, the opportunity to just let things happen. The idea that everything has to come from our thought, from our control, is also kind of a fantasy. This was a very good thing, and it was a choice. I think most of you know, right? This is one of the most iconic landscapes in the world, at least for conservation people. This is Yosemite, and there is an adjacent area that looks exactly like this 100 years ago that was turned into a reservoir for San Francisco, the Hetchy Hetchy Reservoir. And nowadays, it's a big question what to do with this. This is the question, what to do with this. It's our decision. We've been engineering things for a very long time. We're not necessarily great at it. We have lots of failures, but we also have a lot of sustainable successes. The idea that engineering is always a bad thing, I think, is not the way to think about it. There are new ways to live. We are discovering them. We are creating them. Those possibilities are probably the most important things for the future. And then we can even go into territory where we don't really know what we're doing. And a great example is something like rewilding, where you're actually just taking an area and putting in some species that resemble those that were there before. It may not have been the same species, and just letting it go. Letting nature go and experimenting with that. That is still possible. That is still a good idea. So fundamentally, the most important thing is we need to get away from this idea that there's this Holocene, this natural planet that is there for the taking. Right? That humans are destroying this natural planet that could be here somehow, and go toward the planet that we actually have. We have a planet transformed by humans over thousands of years, and we need to think about the natures that we have embedded within our societies that we can do better with. That's the future. And just some simple take-home messages, the idea, we are always going to transform places where we live. We are niche constructors. That is the basis for how we have survived and prospered as a species. This is the process that enabled us to transform the whole planet. We remade the planet. We did this mostly intentionally, also unintentionally, but we did it. And it enabled us to do something unusual. And then finally, this process is continuing. And the big question is where we want it to go, how we want to guide it. It's not going to stop. Thank you.